John Cavanaugh was a hero during the French and Indian War. He survived Fort Necessity, a brutal combat between the French and the British. He also survived the attack on Bushy Run, where he became a noble war hero. After the war, John was sent into the wilderness to find a new way to live. But war isn't about men, but politics, and the British Army wasn't done with its wartime efforts. Striking a deal with the right folks is like striking a deal with the devil. You never know the outcome until it's too late. Striking a deal with a partner in these times was always a gamble, but at this stage in his life, one John was willing to take on. War was no way to live, and the wilderness was much more peaceful. The pines stretched like green spears into the heavens, silent sentinels over a land both beautiful and brutal. John Cavanaugh, a seasoned American frontiersman, moved through them with ease of a wolf, through brush, long rifle slung over his shoulder, senses sharp. He had survived wars, winters, and worse, but nothing prepared him for this betrayal. His so-called friend, Edward Hathorne, was a dashing British officer turned fur trader. They met years ago in the Hudson Bay trading post and fought side by side against raiders, shared whiskey by firelight, and made bold plans to open a trade route deeper into the untamed West. John believed him a brother, but Edward had different ambitions, and teaming with the British, loyalties. "You go south into the Crowlands," Edward had said one morning, eyes too calm. "I've arranged a scout to guide you. Trust him." The scout was silent, a lean young man with sharp eyes and a necklace of bear claws. He called himself Tyanita, young wolf. He didn't speak much, just pointed and moved, his movements quick, deliberate, almost wrong. Days passed, and the land twisted. The streams looped back. Landmarks vanished. John was being led in circles. One night by the fire, John sharpened his knife. "You lost or something? Or just playing games?" he asked in a low voice. Tyanita stared into the flames. "You were not meant to return," he said simply. John stiffened. "The hell does that mean?" Tyanita sighed. "The pale man paid me in whiskey and bullets to lead you off the trail. I took both, but I did not kill for him." John stared silently, then spoke up. "Why not?" The young scout looked up. "Because I saw you save a boy from the river 3 days ago. You did not know I was watching, but I was." John sat back, the crackle of the fire filled with the silence. "What happens now?" he asked. Tyanita drew a pine cone into the flames. "Now, we survive together. I know a real path west, but it is not easy." So they went, side by side, not Scout and Mark, but two men cut from different cloths and stitched together by a harsh needle of wilderness. They faced storms that stripped bark off trees. They hunted elk and deer and shared meat in bitter winds. They fought off a gang of trappers going feral, blood and snow mixed underfoot. Slowly, trust grew. They laughed, they shared stories, they became brothers in a way neither had expected. Years later, they found Edward Hawthorne at a riverside camp, smug and surprised. He reached for his pistol. Tyanita's arrow pinned his hand to a tree before the hammer even cocked. John walked up slowly. "You said we were partners," Edward sneered. "You were a means to an end." John looked at Tyanita. "And this here?" He nodded. "He's the future. You're just the past, still clinging to crowns and coins." Edward lived, barely, but his empire in the woods was done. As spring warmed the hills, John and Tyanita built a cabin by the river. They traded furs, learned each other's tongues, and taught others that friendship didn't need to match in color or creed, only in fire, forged true. And so, under the shadow of pine and sky, betrayal gave way to something stronger, something wilder, something real. They became two brothers in arms, locked together in a common bond on unity. This was nothing a war hero had ever experienced. Kindness and gratitude filled his soul. By the time the snow thawed and the creeks ran wild with meltwater, John Cavanaugh had almost forgotten what it was like to bleed for something. Life by the river with Tyanita was simple, hard and clean. They built with their hands, hunted with honor, and sat by the fire without looking over their shoulders. But peace in the wilderness was a fragile thing. One morning, while checking traps along the eastern ridge, John noticed smoke, thick, black, unnatural. Not a cooking fire, not a campfire. It was too heavy, too high. Something was wrong. Tyanita joined him minutes later, eyes scanning the horizon. "That's near the Kayukia Trail," he said. "The old mound city ruins in the south. Once a thriving center for trade and power of the native peoples, now silent and overgrown. Few dared tread there anymore." John adjusted the rifle on his back. "Let's see who's kicking up ghosts." They moved fast and silent, shadows among the trees. What they found chilled them more than any winter wind. A small band of Shawnee had been ambushed, slain with precision. Arrows snapped in their backs, powder burns marking their throats. But these weren't killed in battle. This was an assassination. Among the bodies was a familiar face, Little Crow, a chieftain Tyanita had once called a friend. Pinned to his chest was a scrap of parchment, English script, spidery and sharp. "Leave this land, or the fire will spread. E.H. Edward Hawthorne." "Thought we ended that bastard," John muttered. Tyanita picked up the note and stared at it a long time. "The serpent has shed its skin. It did not die." The trail led south, through black pine woods, and into lands neither of them had charted. They heard whispers of a new trading post near Shadow Fork, built not by trappers but by mercenaries and deserters, men with no loyalty but coin. At the center of it all, a man called himself the Baron. He wore a powdered wig, even in the forest. He claimed domination over miles of land, enforcing it with hired guns and poison treaties. And he was Edward Hawthorne in everything but name. "He's building an empire on fear," Tyanita said. "Then we tear it down," John replied. The deeper they went, the more dangerous the journey became. A French mercenary tracked them for 2 nights before Tyanita caught his scent and ended him with a silent knife. They crossed paths with a band of escaped slaves, led by a woman named Mara, who spoke with fire and fought with fury. She joined them. Her cause was freedom, and her wrath was holy. The trio grew into a small rebellion. Trappers, tribesmen, outcasts, and former soldiers, people with no place in the world Edward Hawthorne was trying to build. Together, they became the teeth of the land. They struck supply lines, freed captive villages, burnt down stockades. Every time Edward's men struck back, they disappeared into the trees like smoke on wind. But war, even righteous war, eats at the soul. One night as frost kissed the mossy earth, John sat by the fire and stared at the stars. "Does this ever end?" he asked. Tynita nodded toward the flames. "Only when we make it end." The final battle came at Cahokia itself. Edward had turned the ruins into a fortress. Wood palisades raised atop ancient mounds, cannons aimed at the riverbanks. But he'd underestimated the land. The earth had memory, and so did the people. John led the charge from the west, using the old animal paths. Mara's people came by the river, with canoes striking from below. Tynita, he walked in through the front gates, wearing a skull of a bear and a cloak of crow feathers. Fear did half the work for him. The fight was brutal. Fire lit the old city. Gunshots echoed off burial mounds. John found Edward in the temple ruin, dressed like a king, still clinging to crowns. John said. Edward sneered. "You could have ruled beside me." John pulled the trigger. The shot echoed like thunder. The Baron of the Woods fell. Years passed. Trees grew over the ruins. The trails turned to whispers. But in the valley by the river, there were two men who had once sat by a fire as strangers. There stood a village, not white, not native, not ruled, but shared. John Cavanaugh grew old there. Tynita too. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, children could hear stories about how the world changed, not by kings or armies, but by firelight, friendship, and a promise never to betray again.